Hi, I'm Neil Hermes and welcome to my weekly bird wrap. This week I've got 3 more great stories from the world of birds around the world. First one is about an amazing story of a research project that's gone on for 75 years. The second one is a study of the status of birds across the globe. And the last one is a fabulous story about a massive breeding event of pelicans in Lake Brewster in Australia. Hi, I'm Neil Hermes and welcome to my weekly bird wrap. My first story is a fascinating story about a study that's gone on in Oxfordshire in the UK since 1947. Now, some land was left to some researchers, a woodland patch, 800 acres, for bird research into the future. And there's been a huge amount of research work done on great tits in this particular piece of English woodland. And we now have data over 75 years of 40 generations of great tits and their breeding success over that time. That's like taking the history of humans back, say, to the 10th century in terms of our knowledge of generations. It's an amazingly long study. And one of the things that they've been able to do is put up nest boxes in this forest, 800 or so nest boxes, and they've been able to follow the 40 generations of this small, absolutely classical English bird over these many years. Great tits feed their young on caterpillars, and caterpillars emerge from the oak forests in that particular reserve at a particular time of year when the tits time their breeding to start. The average tit couple will collect 10,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of its young. And this is an amazing effort by these small birds. And one of the things that's happened from this study over many years is there's many reports have been able to be produced. And one of the things we now know is that over that period, the time of nesting has shifted by about 3 weeks because the caterpillars have been coming out earlier and earlier. And so the nesting time for the great tits has shifted over that time. It's extraordinary the information we can get from these long-term studies, and I'm sure there's going to be more fascinating work from this, and I'm really keen to read some more reports about this particular study in Oxfordshire in the UK and hope that it goes for many more years to come. My second story today is it concerns a paper that was published in the Annual Review of Environmental Resources just in the last week or so. And in this paper, it looks at the number of birds in the world and their status in terms of whether they're increasing or decreasing. And there was some really interesting data in this particular paper. First of all, there's around about 11,000 species of birds on the planet today. Now, it depends on the taxonomy you use, whether you include certain species as one species or split them into two, etc. But let's say there's around 11,000, and that's the basis on which this paper was prepared. It then looked at whether or not the birds internationally were on the increase or on the decrease or stable. And one of the things that they've assessed is that around about half the birds in the world are probably in some sort of decline. About 40% of the birds in the world, species in the world, are essentially stable, and around about 10% are on the increase. These are interesting statistics in terms of understanding the populations of birds. One of the things I did notice in the paper is it did refer to an event that is not often mentioned, and that is whilst we have 11,000 species in the world today, there was a massive extinction event that occurred when the Polynesians explored and colonized all of the Pacific back in the 10th, 12th century, I think it was. 1,000 bird species went extinct during that period. The paper I referred to assesses around about 1,500 bird species are critically endangered in the world currently. And one of the things I found interesting is that the biggest areas of concern are in the tropics. The largest concentrations of different species, of course, are in the warmer parts of the world, in the tropics. So in Central America, in the Amazon, in Central Africa, and through Indonesia, Southeast Asia, etc. So the tropics are where the concentrations of birds occur. And 85% of the concerns around bird species declining are birds from that part of the world. So that's where the concern is. And there's really three big issues that are affecting birds internationally when you look at it. The three really big factors are habitat removal, and that's the big one. The second one is exotic species, so new species coming in like mammals that will eat the eggs, or birds like exotic birds like starlings in some places that will move native bird species out of their nests. That's a second big factor. And in many of these countries, hunting is also still a big factor. So they're the factors we have to be concerned about in looking at these species that are in some sort of decline. But it's interesting to read it in context to see how around the world birds are faring. And in decline, it may be a temporary decline, and even stable birds may be only temporarily stable. So there's a lot of interpretation to make around this data, but it's very useful to have these reports come out regularly so that we can make an assessment where we are and put our efforts where it really counts in terms of protecting birds, and not perhaps get distracted by characteristic birds or birds that we think might be the ones we should be concentrating on. These studies give us a real focus for where we should be putting our effort. So my last story today is about an amazing breeding event that's occurring in Australia at the moment. With the heavy rain that we've had in Australia over the last couple of years, we've had amazing flooding of the inland of Australia. Our inland rivers have been running absolutely a bunker, and the inland lakes like Lake Cowell, Lake Brewster, the Kinchika Lakes, Lake George near Sydney have all filled to capacity. And what this has done is it's meant that for some water birds, the conditions now are ideal for breeding, and are the best breeding conditions that they've been for years or even decades. At Lake Brewster in central New South Wales, there's a breeding event of pelicans, that's the Australian pelican, where they have 30,000 birds breeding. This is one of the largest concentrations of pelicans breeding that's been known. Normally we might get small colonies of maybe a couple of hundred birds that nest in many seasons, but these huge concentrations are exceptional, and this is a record number. 30,000 pelicans, to feed their young, have to collect something like 30 tonnes of fish a day to feed their chicks. The amount of food being produced in these lakes to sustain these colonies of birds is amazing. So we are really, encouraged by this breeding event. Pelicans have been seemingly in decline in Australia over the last decade or two. So maybe these big events are what maintains the population over decades and over centuries. It would seem that for some pelicans, they might only get an opportunity, even though they're fairly long-lived birds, they might only get an opportunity to have a real crack at nesting maybe 3 or 4 times during their lifetime. So it's a fascinating event. It's being studied by university researchers out of Sydney. They're using drones to monitor parts of the population so that they can see what success is happening. And the lake area has been closed off from the general public because pelicans are quite sensitive to disturbance when they're breeding. So an amazing event in central New South Wales at the moment with the Australian pelicans doing so well. So that's all I have for you for my wrap this week. I hope you've enjoyed the 3 stories. And if you want to see more, go to my website, check out some more stories on my YouTube channel, and happy birding.